Hello everyone, and if it sounds a little bit different today, that's because I'm using two different mics and I don't know what I'm doing because of technical issues. So anyway, on with the video. So today's video was delayed because of the tag nonsense that's now behind me, unless he does something more stupid. So let's get to the real issues, shall we? This blog post has interested me for quite a while now, at least a week. So I think it's about time I respond to it. So let's do that, shall we? And this is from Women's Aid, the feminist charity for women and children, dedicated to fighting domestic violence and advocating for other women's issues. And the title of the blog is Equal Rights, Different Needs. Well, sounds innocuous enough, but what's it about? Well, let's go to the subheading. Yes, men need support for domestic abuse. No, domestic abuse is not gender neutral. Our chief executive, Polly Neat, blogs on why we can't treat men and women the same when it comes to domestic abuse. The cognitive dissonance couldn't be more apparent. Men need help with domestic abuse, yet it's not a gender neutral problem. And this therefore means that men and women should be treated differently. We should not treat their problem in regards to this issue as the same, which is just laughable. But let's carry on, shall we? We need to encourage all victims of domestic abuse to come forward, writes Michael Malone for The Telegraph. Yes, indeed. Until we are a society in which seeking help is normal and abuse of any kind no longer tolerated, we tacitly allow those in situations of power to exploit it. This is to the detriment or even destruction of those who have less power. So immediately a lot of buzzwords, a lot of interesting language at play here. But let's just break this down as simply as we can to make sense of it all. She claims we are a society where seeking help is not normal. Well, I'm sorry, but this is all down to individual kind of genetic things to do with the genders. On the one hand, you've got women who seek help more regularly than men do, and men do not. But in the case of this particular thing, women get all the help they need because, one, the issue is taken far more seriously with them and they have far more resources allocated to them, which is also a point of contention in this article, while men are not treated as seriously. In fact, they're treated as usually the abusers and the perpetrators rather than as potential victims, hence why a lot of them do not go for help because they may well be arrested for something that they didn't do. Now, that's not to say that domestic violence is not reciprocal. Of course it is, most of it is. But the fact of the matter is, men are being ignored or not helped as well as they should be. But apparently, women as well, despite the evidence pointing to the contrary. She even claims that abuse is tolerated, yet abuse clearly is not tolerated when it's directed at women, but is slightly more tolerated when it's directed at men and boys. So again, as I mentioned before, she's just making stuff up and the evidence and reality points to something completely different. And what's this about people with power? Does she mean the abusers? Does she mean the governments? She does reference governments, by the way. What does she mean by that? That doesn't make any sense. And how does that mean that we should treat men and women differently in regards to domestic abuse? That's a complete non sequitur. What has power got to do with this other than domestic abusers do have a power trip with this, and it is about power, but is she referring to them? She doesn't say. Superficially, Michael and I agree, but the key to where we differ is in that word power. Really, power? Because you seem to be conflating it with political power, but then again the personal is political with feminists, rather than, maybe personal power or psychological power. But then again, I don't know what she means. She kind of doesn't really make her mind up as to what she means by power, but then again, it's got to be vague, hasn't it? And let me say right now, I am not pretending to support the arguments this article makes. Where we differ is where there is any notion that supporting all victims of abuse means treating them all the same, because doing that means ignoring the causes of so much of the most deeply ingrained abuse, both in our society in the UK and across the world. Unequal power and a sense of entitlement, the tools to abuse and protection from censure that this inequality brings. Well, firstly, you pretty much are pretending, especially as we go further on into this article, but hey, whatever, keep on virtue signalling as you did before. How exactly does supporting all victims and treating them the same ignore causes? How? That is just an assertion that you have made, and I'm going to dismiss that because you have no evidence to back that up whatsoever. Unequal power, censure, and other things that she mentioned. Well, considering that we don't treat male victims with nearly as much seriousness, and we don't prosecute and punish women perpetrators with the same amount of seriousness as well, makes you wonder why she's trying to infer that this is some kind of male thing. Because remember, it's not gender neutral. Surely that is doing all these things for women. The abusers that are women are empowered to continue to do this bullshit while men are not. They're censured. But hey, whatever, let's continue. It ignores the huge part of the iceberg that is underwater, yet is the most dangerous. The centuries-old oppressions that may be concealed by good manners sometimes, but whose pull is still irresistible today. The racism and sexism that led mostly white people and men to elect a racist and sexist president of the United States. This is a furious, overwhelming, disproportionate backlash against even the gentlest notion that their assumed superiority might be in doubt. Now, who do you think she's referring to? She's not referring to all abusers, she's referring to men. Now, let's just break this down because there's a lot of things to debunk. Firstly, most of Trump's supporters were white and female. Yes, that was the demographic that voted for him the most, mainly because they also happen to be the demographic that votes the most. And of course, you can't help but bring up the centuries oppression notion and somehow brings in racism to that because, women have been oppressed for years, allegedly by men. So therefore, it's okay for us to treat men and women differently when it comes to domestic violence, rather than, treat the problem as a gender neutral problem and solve all issues the way they ought to be, which is with seriousness and with openness, and to make sure that abusers are punished and sent to jail. But hey, whatever. And of course, the male superiority bullshit. She doesn't really point to any examples. She alludes to stuff that you have to look up for yourself because there's no footnotes, no sources or anything that shows that men are superior, although men don't think they're superior in the West. But apparently this is ancient Greece that we live in, where men consider themselves superior to women in every single way. So whatever, people. Let's continue. Hitchens raises that as well because, again, it's an assertion without evidence. That's why, at the tip of that iceberg, nearly half of women killed in the UK are killed by an intimate partner or former partner, compared to 6% of men killed, and not all of those killed by a woman. That's why 89% of victims of 4 or more incidents of abuse, and the overwhelming majority of victims of repeated patterns of coercion and control, are women. That's why women need to be able to flee for their lives to a refuge, but men fleeing abuse are almost never hunted down as women are, and women are often hunted with the collusion of others and harshly punished. And that is why an average of 2 women a week in England and Wales are killed by a partner or ex-partner. Well, how many of those women are killed by other women? You're saying that the men aren't always killed by other men, but we know that the most brutal relationships, and the ones that do it the most, demographic at least, are lesbians. They abuse each other more. And would it be higher, this 6%, if some of these women weren't claiming that it was self-defense when really they murdered this man because they were actually the abusers? I know that's purely conjecture on my part, but I would wager that if it was proven, those numbers would rise quite significantly, I would imagine. Now, this statistic is, of course, true. It's from the ONS, which is the Office of National Statistics, and it is true. Women are 44% more likely to be killed in that kind of homicide compared to men, which is 6%. But the other one, the 89%, I have no idea. I can't find anything on it. I'm sure somebody will find it in the comments. But for all I know, she could be chatting shit. But that still doesn't disprove the notion that we shouldn't treat all of them the same and this is somehow a gendered issue. Again, she's proving that it is gender neutral, and she will only prove that as we go on. And what's this about fleeing abuse and how the things are apparently different? Women get pursued more while men do not. Well, she doesn't bring any actual statistics up to back this up, and it's all just conjecture from what I can add. It's just another assertion. But I would wager that maybe there's more women getting chased because most of the male victims are being arrested. Not necessarily tried, but just being arrested. So they either can't flee or they can't chase if it's reciprocal. So again, a load of unsubstantiated bullshit along with some accurate statistic. She then goes on to say, that's why when we talk about violence against women, the response is, but all violence is wrong, simply misses the point. Just as the response, but all lives matter, when made to Black Lives Matter protesters is itself racist, the riposte, treat all victims the same, is sexist. Firstly, how is all lives matter racist, saying that black lives, white lives, everybody's lives matter? How is that racist? What's racist is them saying that they're entitled enough to say that black lives matter more than, say, police lives or white lives, because they have this preconceived notion, this wrong notion that they're being oppressed in American society. I don't think so. Also, when that same rhetoric is backed up by racism, yeah, apparently we're the racist by saying all lives matter, but whatever. How is saying that all violence is wrong sexist? But then again, it is sexist because you want only violence against women to matter and not a violence against men. Because it seems to me that you're suggesting, or at least inferring, that violence against men is okay, or at least not as bad as violence against women, which is in itself sexist. And then, similarly, you then say that treat victims the same is somehow sexist, when it isn't. You can't prove it is. Just because you say it is doesn't mean it isn't. But those responses have power, I wrote about the damaging effects of so-called gender neutrality on services for women survivors of domestic abuse some time ago. The statistical arguments I made then that show how we routinely misrepresent the true levels of violence against women in the UK are still valid. The most recent Women's Aid survey of local domestic abuse services showed unequivocally that resources are being removed from services for women in order to create services for men. This is a twisted version of equality which ignores the realities of power, who wields it and who is harmed by it. So it is about the money. This is what this is all about. This is not about the victims. This is not about domestic violence. This is about you wanting to get your money. You want to get paid. This is actually not about getting funding for your shelters. This is all about you. Because this is a multi-million pound investment for you. You want to make money off this. This is your full-time job. Gender neutrality is necessary because, one, it's clearly not a gender-specific crime, as you've tried not to point out but have pointed out in your cognitive dissonance, and it will help survivors. It will help attitudes. It will show that, yes, men can not only be victims but can also be compassionate people who can help victims. Erin Pitsey made sure that men were in her shelters to show not just the women but the kids as well, that men are not all evil. A lot of victims who are female come out of their trauma thinking that all men are evil, even though it was one or two, possibly three men in their lives who were doing the nasty things. And let's not also forget that domestic violence is also reciprocal. It doesn't matter who starts it. How exactly are the figures being misrepresented? You can't prove that. You're clearly not proving anything. Quoting yourself doesn't prove anything. And also, if you're going to use the ONS results, why the hell are you then attacking said people for misrepresenting women? But hey, I guess when their statistics back your point up, they're okay, eh? How exactly this is a twisted version of equality, I don't know. And also, are they actually taking money away from women's services, or are they just allocating money that they would have allocated in the past, but instead taking it to men's shelters where there are much less? You think that some of that money could go to men as well? Again, how exactly is this a twisted form of equality? If anything, you are advocating for a twisted version of equality because you want the money to go to you and you alone. You want yourself to be propped up and men's needs to be ignored. That's what you're basically arguing for. And how does it ignore the realities of power? Again, men and women can both wield power over each other in myriad of different ways. It's not a gender thing. It never has been and it never will be. The survey also showed that there are more local services for male victims of domestic abuse than ever before, with at least 146 local specialist services providing specific support for them around the country. And yes, contrary to belief in some quarters, I think that's a very good thing. Well, apparently it's not a good thing, because before that you just said that they're taking money away from you when really they're allocating money they would have given you in the past to these places, and that's wrong. So how exactly is that a good thing to you? And also, that doesn't make anything better. Men's services are still heavily outnumbered, heavily underfunded in comparison to women. This is okay, yeah, it's better than it was, but it's not as good as it could be. We should have as many shelters for men as women, because a lot of times men don't have anywhere to go. Men aren't even allowed in women's shelters in many places, because these shelters, there's only 146 of them, will fill up incredibly quickly. So where do these men go? Do they slog it out in their homes, which most of them do? Do they leave and become homeless and then become part of that 90%? To listen to some men's rights activists, you would think there is no help available for men. I can only imagine this propaganda is designed to fuel a sense of victimhood. And when those who in reality have power start to feel victimised and therefore justified in demanding change, frankly, they become dangerous, as recent political developments have shown. Trump has never shown himself to be an MRA or even an egalitarian. Now, is it dangerous because they are attacking and beating your narrative and making sure that men's needs are being dealt with and that more funding is being allocated to setting up more of these shelters, and that's taking money that you want away? This is what it is. It's not dangerous because of so-called attitudes that you've made up, but because they're threatening your livelihood and they're threatening your narrative and your agenda, and you don't like that. Before we get into this whole victimhood thing, which she elaborates on further, I find it funny that while you have done nothing but paint women as helpless victims in this, like there's no reciprocal violence, there's no, oh yeah, women commit at least 45 to 50% of the crime as well. No, women are all totally victims, while men, you know, oh, it's not as bad. Yeah, apparently we're downplaying things. but you aren't, right? Let's get into that victimhood mentality, shall we? Let the hypocrisy shine through. Victimhood is not a competition. There should be help for all who need it, but by cutting services for women, lives are put at risk. Of course men need support to recover from domestic abuse, but to deny that the iceberg exists is to deny the roots of the still rising tide of violence against women in misogyny and inequality, is to turn our backs on prevention. A feminist telling us that victimhood is not a competition. You couldn't make it up if you tried. So I guess that's why the progressive stack exists. And I guess that's why you guys are always competing for that money. You know what's weird? You're right. Domestic violence things are being cut by this government. But guess what? Men are also suffering from those cuts as well. Do you think they're allocating it to men's shelters? No, they're not. They're allocating a portion, a tiny fraction of their budget to men. And that just so happens to be more than they used to, as I said before. How exactly is this violence rising? Violence in general has been decreasing, although domestic violence against men has been increasing. That's why it's at 45%. Although that's probably because more men are now becoming more brave enough to actually report it. But hey, whatever, it's all misogyny, inequality, it's a gendered thing, whatever, people. And then she finishes, if we don't acknowledge the cause of domestic abuse, we can never stop it. So no, don't treat men and women the same. Treat them according to their need. Oh, so we shouldn't treat them the same because gender, because reasons. Because you have said that women have it worse, even though it's quite obvious that men clearly are being ignored. Men are clearly not having their issues taken as seriously. So if we treat them the same, that will sort that out. But no, you don't want that to happen because of the money. Anyway, people, this is basically what these people believe. And this is further showing how much of an economic game this is to them. They're not interested in the victims. They're interested in themselves and making money. I could go on, but I just repeat myself. So this has been Charming Man 93. Like, share the video, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you all later.